I think, well, this can be, it's a small enough group that it can be, I prefer it if it was actually pretty informal. So I'm a painter. I'm a professor here, one of two full-time painting and drawing professors at Westchester. But I'm an artist, I'm a painter, and when we do these kinds of like lecture things, it tends to be called an artist talk, and it's this kind of layout of some sort of big general themes that occur in the work, some interests that the artist has, and then sort of bringing the audience kind of through the journey, of sort of the how the work has changed over time, the journey, where life and art kind of start to connect and influence each other and that sort of thing. And I want to do that. And so the talk here today will be more or less kind of structured. I'm going to sort of tell you about my work and kind of tell you about this kind of journey that I've been on. But I also want to, take the opportunity. There's some of my students and people that I know are here that are art students, and I'm really excited that they're here. But I'm assuming for a lot of you guys, this is a sort of non-art audience, and I'm excited to kind of look for ways to kind of, cross that sort of disciplinary bridge and kind of open up the discussion and open up the conversation to ways that sort of creativity and ways that the process can connect to some of your interests. And as informal as we can keep it, the better. So if I'm, contemporary painting is sort of highly coded, right? Like to like an art audience, to those in the know, to the insiders, there's this kind of there might be stylistic references, there might be subject, references with certain type of subject matter that the educated art audience would be able to kind of read the way you'd read a book, right? And sort of separate the content of the meaning of the work from sort of being able to kind of read those references. And there tends to be, actually I found across most different disciplines, there's a kind of secret language that goes into it, right? Where so when I say I want it informal, if I'm talking about something and you literally have no idea what I'm saying because I'm speaking in like art-ese, please interrupt me, please tell me to slow down, that kind of thing. I'm gonna try to move fast because as my students know, I can just go and go and go. And because I'm showing you my work and you're like my babies and everything, like I probably put, way too many images to get through, and I probably want to talk about too many things, and I want to keep it, I want to keep it interesting. But who are you guys? Many of you are in Chris's class. Maybe we can just talk about sort of your interest in creativity, your interest in sort of the artistic process and what it can do for how you connect to it.
I'm going to start, because everyone seems to be quiet.
Yeah. It's early.
So, I'm actually almost 2 years retired, and I would say maybe about a year and some months ago, I started this wonderful journey taking an 8 mindfulness course.
Yeah.
And through that, I come from a very artistic family anyway, basically into music as opposed to the arts, even though I will brag that my uncle was actually designing for Vogue at one point. Yeah, that is pretty amazing. So I really do appreciate and understand the connection between the arts and spirituality.
Yeah.
So I noticed that WCU offers these courses. I was shocked. I didn't know that they even had a study in contemplative studies. So I wanted to explore exactly what this looks like and what's being offered. And so when I saw the seminar today in terms of the meld between mindfulness and the art, it really intrigued me. So that's why I'm here.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think to me, this is this is sort of a new experience, a new kind of, I mean, you know, I'm heading in, I'm very interested in sort of advocating for the arts in general, and I'm really, I'm a true believer in the power of kind of, you know, the creativity and kind of making things in terms of how that can transform individuals' lives, in terms of how it can transform the community, all of that. But this is sort of new for me too. I don't know, before I was sort of prepping for this, if I had necessarily thought about my work in terms of mindfulness.
Right.
But the way I understand mindfulness is this idea of being sort of present in a non-judgmental way, right? And I think that's something that's so key to the creative process, and it's something that we artists do over and over. We couldn't make anything without sort of that idea in mind. Teaching like drawing one or painting one, like these kind of like introductory art classes, like step one is to try to get them not to sort of get them to not be hard on themselves, not to beat themselves up, not to be frustrated, right? There's this idea of like, you want to come up to and work with oil paints for the first time, and you're like a master, you know, it like doesn't look right, and I think sort of the way you can connect to the kind of process and like let it happen without judging, and then finding like the right moment to step back and be self-critical, right? But for the most part, just allowing for discoveries, allowing for surprises. I think that's really key to sort of any creative act. At least to me, that sort of connects to this idea of sort of mindfulness. Am I on the right track?
Yes, you are.
All right, good. My talk is not ruined yet.
I think this is a very dynamic kind of thing, and we all are kind of in the place of not knowing, which is really actually what mindfulness kind of evokes in us. So we don't know, and we're not like attached to a particular outcome.
Right.
So I think that you're just explaining it in a very, very, real way.
Yeah.
You know, this is how the creative process is being contemplative. In this moment, we are with whatever is arising on the paper, as opposed to judging it. So I think that that's an incredible gift that
it really winds up being key, and I think that like actually that is something, as I've kind of matured as a painter, that I've been more in touch with. You know, when you have the more experience you gain in any particular, you know, medium or any particular kind of path, right? The more you're willing to kind of let go of control, right, and kind of trust, trust your ability to kind of, connect with the thing that you're making through time. What else? Anybody? Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm ready to articulate my thinking, but I teach first grade.
Yeah.
And so listening to you talking, I'm thinking, my gosh, I should be living this every day, but I'm not, because the children have so many judgments already about their work and their creativity and their better, and wanting and requesting and demanding sometimes like what the product should look like so they can mimic it. And I guess I'm sitting here thinking, gosh, I guess I'm here because practicing mindfulness for myself, practicing, I'm creative, but I'm not an artist. So I do judge my work a lot, but I have this need to create. But I feel like those first graders, the dot to dot, the color by number, wanting it to be something prescribed that I can do easily that will create a product. And I think I'm really sad that 6-year-olds feel that way. Like, I get why I feel that way. I don't get why first graders feel that way. And I want to bring some mindfulness to their process so that they can just explore and create without having to ask me all the time, am I doing it right? Is this what you wanted? Is this, I think they get frustrated with me because I'm like, I don't care. Like, this is just a thought, an idea. You use it and create your own, but it's really hard to get them out of the little box that they're sitting in already.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I have a first grader. I have two sons. I have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old.
Okay.
So my 6-year-old Henry's in first grade right now. So I know what you mean. There's a kind of like I almost feel like it's a cultural thing, right? Because we have a kind of goal-oriented kind of culture, and there's like outcomes that need to be kind of measured, right? And it's sort of you lose. You mentioned the word kind of explore, right? I mean, that's kind of really what you want. That's kind of what it's all about. That's where actually like the learning comes from.
Right.
It's one of my nemesis is this painting with a twist stuff, right? You know what I mean? Like, and part of it, and it's fun and it is what it is. It's not really
I
something.
have done one.
Yeah, it's not really something that I get like upset about or like drive past and like growl or something like that. But it's sort of like let's all paint the same thing and this kind of cookie cutter definition of what an outcome should be and I think and we'll get into it when we start looking at my work is that I that's kind of not how I kind of operate and that's not kind of how I work. Maybe in first grade it's just a matter of like don't tell them where they're supposed to take it. It's like the materials and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
I think too, and I don't know, I think we know that like physical activity or it can elicit mindfulness, but are we be mindful, like trying to get them to be mindful when they're doing it in the process. But I also think, I know we want art to just kind of be whatever it is, but when you look back, I mean, it's used as a way to express emotions.
Yeah.
And although in mindfulness, we kind of just want to acknowledge those emotions and let them go, it's a way for people to identify what it is they may be experiencing at the moment.
Sure.
And I'm connecting the two of you with what I do.
Right.
I actually teach special education high school, but my kids are kids that have very traumatic pasts, and there's a lot going on. And my kids, I guess I can say, probably feel like they've been rightfully so judged their entire life.
Yeah.
Because they've always been looked at, measured, put into therapies, So there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of emotion. I come from more of a writing background, but I've always loved, to dabble in artistic stuff. So with mindfulness, I came in as a teacher trying to figure out how to reduce my stress, with working with the kids every day to keep myself in a really good place for them. But, the judgment thing, it keeps coming up with my kids, like how they can let go of that. And I notice when we do some things that are very creative, it kind of turns their mind a little bit. And they quit looking at themselves in that way. They're just kind of like feeling themselves. Does that make, once they get past the emotions, it's like, oh, I didn't know I could do that. I didn't know I could. So it reaches kind of a different level on with some people.
Yeah.
Too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I definitely think there's something about creating, there's something that it maybe goes beyond language a little bit sometimes too, where like, you can't express the trauma verbally, but in making something you're sort of, you're exercising.
And it's interesting, every one of my kids expresses through either words, they're real poets, real writers, or they sketch constantly. And the more upset they get, they want to sketch, they want to do. So it's almost inherent in us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some of it is, I think, I'm a retired teacher, is the students want to be accepted. And that acceptance is what limits them to think freely on their own. I remember when I taught elementary school, and a lot of times, things that I learned was do not put a model up for the kids of what you want them to do. Let them figure it out. And I know, I'll speak for this guy here, he, in school, he would get yelled at if his turkey didn't look like a freaking turkey. Or you're drawing with your left hand. You're not supposed to be drawing with your left hand. You're supposed to be drawing with your right hand.
Yeah.
So the acceptance thing, I think, is part of what bars us from liberating ourselves to being able to express ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Sort of like you sort of prejudge yourself because you're worried about how what you do or who you are kind of connects to that kind of larger community or that other
How
kind
you-
of
yeah.
conversation that it's
Yeah.
not always about. I
How
mean,
you really
and that's
fit
kind of
in.
part of, and I mean, I think that we make art for ourselves to some degree, but we also make art to reach out, you know what I mean? And to sort of tell our stories and to sort of, I mean, there's, if you sort of think about, for some reason I've been, the opposite of what I do are these kind of Buddhist mandala sand pieces that they kind of make and then they sweep away. And they're intricate, and there's so much time, and it's about the act of making it, and not about the permanence. And like all of Western art is about this kind of like archival material. It's going to go up in the church or it's going to go in the art museum and stay there forever. And that's part of the beauty of it in some ways, right? Is that like you can go up to a Rembrandt and you can look into his eyes, like his self-portrait, as an old man, and look into his eyes and just connect and feel this connection through the ages that's sort of unbelievable and like, sort of tells us about being human, But on the other hand, there's a kind of, there's this other side of it that makes it about ego or something too, And so, yeah, I mean, I think the contradictions are kind of what keeps it interesting, that it's not seamless, and I think the tension between opposites and the tension that's involved in making anything, the tension between the sort of individual and the community, the tension between the moment and history, that's exciting, but it's not like easy, it's not seamless. Any other? Yeah.
I am an author by trade. I write novels for teenagers, and I'm a former teacher at public school. So I I started painting like in July, and I have this hashtag on my Instagram page that says "Do It Afraid" because I was in the beginning painting afraid, and I started writing afraid, and so fear definitely it charged me up enough to do it. But when I was a teacher, I used to tell my kids the same thing. Well, if you're afraid to do it afraid. So that is something that still speaks to me to this day. And my sister's the one who saw the, not the ad, but the thing on Instagram. And she said, Kate,
yeah.
go. I went to school here. I graduated from here with a degree in elementary ed, but that was a long time ago. So I'm very excited to be here. I live in Westchester.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
No.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting how something like, you sort of think fear is negative, you know what I mean? But it doesn't, but if it gets you moving, maybe it's not so negative. I mean, I think all artists have different kind of hang-ups, right? I mean, for me, I actually don't know if I was planning on talking about it, but I think, I was baptized Catholic. I think guilt is a thing. I think there's like guilt motivation, that kind of, you know what I mean? Like you sit in one place for too long and you start to feel really guilty. And so that, that can get me moving.
I'm glad you went before me. I am trained as a marriage family therapist, but I'm a chaplain in the hospital, and I'm struck by how many people come to art late in life, and it contributes so much to the meaning-making piece. But I think it's like what everybody said, it comes from finally having been accepted, then trying to make meaning, being afraid but not caring. Like there's so much in it.
Yeah.
And it's really, really rich.
Yeah.
And people who've never picked up an instrument of any sort of creativity really appreciate it.
No, that's true, and it winds up being so individual too. You know what I mean? Like there's no real recipe for it. But sort of specifically about sort of coming to it later in life. I mean, I think that can be. In some ways you almost come to it more pure that way, right? So I went to art school, I was trained in it, it's my livelihood, and so, I mean, that's another kind of thing, with these kind of hang-ups that you bring with, right? It's not pure, it's, not pure for me, because I'm negotiating all of these different kind of worlds as I make my work. Whereas if it's maybe later, you're not trying to necessarily make a career out of it, you're able to kind of use it in a maybe slightly more kind of use it in a more therapeutic way or something. Yeah. Yeah. Good.
So, as you may know, I have been drawing a lot since I was a little kid, and I was also baptized and confirmed in the Catholic Church. And I really like the art and how it inspired me to be a part of the artistic environment. And I've been doing a lot of art since I was an art major at Delaware County Community College, where I studied graphic design and then finished with the degree in general studies because the advanced levels were too hard for me to complete. But I did have a chance to visit museums and also see Wyatt's. I've been inspired by the Wyatt family in middle school, so I'm definitely excited to go back there again this month and be able to identify what is going on in this world and what I can do to make people realize that there's a lot of art that needs to be put on people's faces at times. And I'm also looking into being an art teacher in a Catholic school because it's very important in my religion, and plus I'm actively involved at the university's Newman Center where I'm a Koinonia sister. And I feel like that if I continue to do art as well as write a book or something and take pictures, because I also have a website where I put a lot of photos on of places wherever I go and on special occasions, so I have a lot of adventures at times.
Yeah. Sounds great. Well, thank you for coming. Yeah, I'm excited that you're here. And,
Me too.
yeah, I mean, you're just the little time that I can't use my painting one class this semester. So. But I love how passionate you are about it. So really, thank you for coming.
No problem.
Should I get into this a little bit? All right, cool. So, like I said, as informal as this winds up being, I'm happy. You guys can see it's all going to be up here. I'm not going to be doing anything. Yeah.
So before we start, maybe what we could do is to, are you going to show us your artwork?
Yeah, lots of it.
Lots of it. So I was just playing around with this idea that maybe we could just take a few breaths together and sort of be opening to the awareness that comes in terms of what you bring to us today.
Yeah.
So as you're in your seat, if you have a cup in your hand or a writing implement, you can just put it down maybe for just a minute. And seeing yourself maybe settling into your chair and your body in a way that feels most comforting to you. And you may have some thoughts lingering, perhaps sensations are arising. And feeling the sensation of your breath in this moment as you sit in this chair. You may feel the breath at the tip of your nose or the back of your throat, or really just noticing the rise and fall of the belly. Seeing if it's possible to come into the sensation. You may not even feel the sensation of the breath. You might feel the pulsation of your heart or the heaviness of your hands on your lap. Perhaps you feel the weight of gravity on your whole body. Giving yourself a few breaths to come into this moment and open to what's available right here. And on the next breath, if your eyes might have been closed, gently opening them to an open awareness. Moving
Thank you so much. That is like such a good way to get into a lecture. I'm usually like slugging coffee down and like right before. This is nice. Okay. So here we go. So this is a recent painting actually. This is a painting that was done last year, and it was part of a show that I had in New York in the March of 2018. It's sort of a placeholder. The talk here is going to be mostly kind of chronological. It's going to be 100% chronological, actually. But to me, in addition to sort of talking about basically what we all kind of discussed as a group, that's another really fantastic way to kind of get into this. I just, one kind of main idea that's kind of followed my interest in painting from the beginning to the present tense is just this idea of creativity, creative act in general, but we're going to be really talking about painting for the most part. This idea of painting as this kind of really crucial kind of interface or focal point or bridge between the sort of internal world of the creator and the external world of experiences and kind of community and sort of culture at large. And so there's so a painting like this, it's an electric candle reflected in a window, and this is something that you see sort of time and again in sort of suburban neighborhoods, right? Around the holidays, they'll put up this candle, and there's always this kind of sense of like a kind of spirit behind it, or something like that, or something kind of meditative behind it to me. But at the same time, they're kind of like electric candles, right? And so there's this kind of like contemporary aspect to it, or kind of they're probably 50 cents at Target or something, and so there's this kind of conflict maybe between this kind of like internal kind of spirit and like the world at large, or maybe conflict might be too strong, kind of negotiation between these things. And so a painting like this has that for me. It also has this kind of idea of reflection into it. I love this idea of painting as a domestic object. I love this idea that you live with it. It changes through time. You see different things in it every day. Your relationship to it kind of grows, and so more, with a lot of my recent work, I'm making these paintings. They're kind of built up out of a lot of layers, and even in the projection, you can see the kind of texture that's on that. And so this painting is kind of playing with ideas of kind of ambiguity and sort of not telling the entire story and leaving it kind of leaving the image kind of open to be interpreted and open to being kind of sort of fostering all these different connections with the viewer possibly. All right. Start from the start here. So this is a painting by Frederick Church, who's a 19th century landscape painter, part of the Hudson River School painters. It was painted in the Hudson Valley in New York, and that's the area that I grew up in. I'm from a town called Middletown, New York, in Orange County. Does anybody know?
I know, I'm a native New Yorker.
Yeah. So I grew up there. It's about 60, 70, 80 miles northwest of New York City. It's on the west side of the Hudson River. And this is the kind of I think when you tell somebody you're from the Hudson Valley, right? This is the history of the Hudson Valley. It sort of conjures this kind of, pastoral, sublime, kind of bucolic kind of imagery in their mind. But growing up there was like anything but that. This is a picture of the gallery Crystal Run, and it's kind of mall culture. It's this kind of, it was this kind of weird mix of Middletown had a kind of inner city with inner city problems. It has plenty of cows and kind of rural things going on. It has a lot of mall culture, strip mall, and kind of commercial things going on. And it is not actually more and more it's really fascinating that like the art world is ever expanding from New York, and it's always moving, you know, looking for, I was just talking to Catherine about, you know, how artists kind of like will find a space and kind of inhabit it and like gentrify it and kind of build it up, and the art world is always expanding. And now, you know, the town that I grew up, Newburgh, which was not far away, Beacon, they're Hudson, which is a little farther north. These are now becoming like very rich kind of artistic communities. But growing up, I would have died for something like that. We had nothing. And so I was interested in art via comic books. I had never been to a museum. I had never really seen anything. I didn't know who, you know, I was probably 16 or 17 before I knew who Van Gogh was, like this kind of thing. But I wanted to draw Spider-Man, you know, and then and so I think the roots of kind of, I mean, I was connecting with my dad via comic books too, and that's you know, through therapy recently I've learned that was important. You know, but also it was just really escapist, I think. You know, like I would sort of, you know, be in your room my room, and I would draw, and I would just spend the summer kind of drawing and copying things at first, and then inventing things and kind of building from there. And it was a kind of, and I think art making, drawing became this kind of, like shelter, right? It became a place where I could, kind of escape from some of the stuff that was going on, and it was something that was, like we were talking about earlier, where I was getting kind of pats on the back. Wow, you drew a great Wolverine. Like, all right, you like me, you know. And so it was a way to kind of reach out to that kind of community, and kind of fit in some ways also. And then from starting with superheroes, then that led me to be interested in more kind of underground, independent comic books, even when I was in high school, and kind of seek them out. It connected me to music via those independent comic books. In some ways, it got me into, at a young age, kind of different types of literature and different types of filmmaking and that sort of thing. And I mean, there's something about the ease of connecting with all of this now. You know, if you're a 16 or 17-year-old now, you have your phone and you are clued into these kind of niche communities in these different areas so quickly. But for me, growing up in sort of upstate in this kind of like, you know, cultural kind of dead zone in a lot of ways, I had to kind of look for it and hunt for it. And that was actually part of the excitement of it, was that I had to really seek it out. And I was like the only kid in the high school who knew about this, and that was also really you know, an integral part of kind of you know, how I got started. And I guess the other thing from, you know, back in you know, those early days was I was just sort of a TV kid. My parents both worked. My parents both worked like 80-hour weeks. My dad was an electrician. He's now retired. And a contractor, and doing stuff like that, and working jobs after his day job. My mom was a nurse in the maternity ward while I was growing up, and then she became a substitute teacher, then she became an elementary school teacher, and then eventually started going back to school for administration. When she retired last year, she was the assistant superintendent. So I mean, she's like really ambitious, and but they're both real hardworking, and so TV was a big part of kind of my world growing up. And you know, remember those colors, because my paintings have a lot to do with this kind of Hanna-Barbera color palette. Something about this kind of blend of naturalism, right, with a kind of real synthetic, heat up, kind of saturated, odd color palette. So I got lucky enough, and it really, I mean, luck doesn't even begin to define it, but I somehow was accepted to the Cooper Union for undergrad. For those of you guys who don't know, Cooper Union is in downtown Manhattan. It's in the East Village, and it's and they have an art school, an architecture school, and an engineering school, and it's full tuition scholarship for all the students that they accept, and it's really selective. I was one of like 60 students who got in. I mean, it was just a stroke. I mean, I was actually, later in life, I was actually on their admissions committee, and I got to, you apply for a home test, they send you a home test, you do a number of drawings and write essays and stuff and send it in, they accept you based on your home test and your academic scores. And I was on the admissions committee, I'm like, these people are brilliant, how did I do that? How did I ever, how was I ever brought in here? I was just very lucky. I kind of have a feeling they were like, this kid, like, let's help him. Let's get him out of there and help him. But I came, so I moved to New York City, and I was in, so I was this is 96, and I was in New York from 96 until I left for a teaching job, which I'll get into later in 2012. So I was there for about more than 15 years. And, not only were my classmates sort of brilliant and like super talented, but they were really informed. They had gone to, as much as like Peter Cooper, who developed the school, would like really thought of it as a kind of community outreach thing, and let's give full tuition scholarships to students in need. They certainly do some of that, but they're also looking broadly at at the United States and saying like, who are the most talented students out there? And a lot of them went to like art high schools and that kind of thing. And so I had a lot of catching up to do. And I had to sort of figure out how to use my strengths and my interests and somehow, and there was just so much learning. There was this whole really exciting aspect of the history, like art history and the history of painting that I was completely unaware of, that I all of a sudden had to kind of learn and catch up with. And that was really exciting to me. But at the same time, this era, this late 90s era of in contemporary art was actually one that was very unfriendly to this idea of painting, right? There's this, if there is this kind of like linear idea of art history, by the time you get into the late 90s, there's a lot about technology, there's a lot about art, painting was seen as very old-fashioned. And at best, and at worst, it was seen as very like, very, very closed off, very kind of like, colonialist. Long story short, there was this feeling that in order to make a painting, like you couldn't just have this kind of joy of painting thing happening, right? Like you had to kind of justify it. And I don't actually know if it's that way anymore. I think times have kind of changed, and I think the audience and professors tend to be more open to different possibilities and different voices. But at the time, I like there needed to be almost like you really had to kind of fight for this idea of like making a painting and making a painting relevant, the relevancy of it was something. And so this is a painting from my undergrad. This is my beginning of my junior year, and I'm you're sort of just figuring out what to paint, and so. I chose these like dog playing poker and dog playing pool, kind of like silly posters, and so I made a bunch of really large paintings based on those, and and you can see there's a kind of like sort of taking that as a source, but then embedding it with a lot of different ideas about painting, right? And so there's looking at like some of the abstract expressionist painters, I'm looking at the pop artists, and I'm kind of all these different types of art and types of thoughts about painting, I'm kind of putting it together and sort of seeing what comes out in the wash. And if they were saying that painting was this kind of passé, kind of old-fashioned thing, then I thought painting dinosaurs and like prehistoric extinct creatures would be really fun and funny. And it was something where I actually was able to kind of get a little elbow room and have a sense of play, right? They're fun, they're interesting. I can, we don't know what that looked like, and so it gives me some room to kind of invent. So this is a painting of a mastodon. Looking at like a lot of like some Eastern art here, and the way that like kind of like a Chinese landscape scroll would kind of set up a sense of space. I'm playing with some kind of iconic kind of signs and symbols here. These like rainbows are just one brush, like load the brush up with 3 different colors, and that kind of thing. So I'm figuring it out. Here's another smaller painting where sort of like the painting as a surface, and there's like cake decoration these are for like children's cake thing, sort of stick them right to the surface. Another kind of dinosaur painting at the time. The legs are made of this stuff called molding paste, and so they're really three-dimensional. They're actually, they actually come off of the canvas about a good 4 inches or so. Behind the, I was using a lot of like enamel, like house paint, and so there's this kind of real glossy surface behind the dinosaur. And yeah, so I was like, it was a really nurturing environment in the end. In spite of this kind of like, I think how I led up to it by saying they didn't want you to paint. It actually wound up being very nurturing, and there was a lot of freedom to explore. I went directly from undergrad to grad school. So I was, what was I? I was like 22 or something like that, and I was accepted at Columbia University for grad school. And that was just becoming this really like hot school, right? And so so my first critique, my first mid-semester critique at grad school, there were some professors there, but there was also directors of like really high-profile galleries that were like joining in the critique and like walking through the studios looking for students to pick up. And I was 22, and I really went for kind of pedagogical reasons. I thought I needed to learn more. I thought if I didn't go to grad school, I might stop painting, so I better keep learning. And it was really intimidating. And so I really kind of shut down for almost a whole year. I mean, I made this kind of nonsense, which is, so I'm thinking, so somehow the dinosaur turned into the landscape for me. And I started thinking about the connection to landscape. I started thinking about landscape as being a really kind of mutable, a really kind of like flexible, changeable idea that does kind of what we were talking about. The landscape is this kind of like vehicle for ideas, right? You can sort of pour ideas and ideologies into the landscape, and then it connects with people in a certain way, right? It's the landscape and the way that we view the landscape as this kind of, similar to painting, as an analogy to painting, as this kind of bridge or focal point between our internal experience and our external one, right? You have this thing where you're walking at night and the landscape, it feels like you're moved, right? This is creepy, like this is a creepy landscape, right? But it's not a creepy landscape, it's just trees. But you are, it's this kind of site of projecting. But also I'll get into it. So this was a failure in some ways, or this was the sort of stab number one. I was also like copying a lot of images. I was spent like a month just drawing out of gardening magazines, just making lots of drawings. I'm searching, These are some watercolors from the time, and this is King Leopold of Belgium from the 19th century, who colonized the Congo and committed genocide and basically used all of that money and all of that conquest to fund his winter garden, which was this kind of greenhouse. So there's like, this is where the guilt comes in too. I'm like looking at myself as kind of inheritor of this idea of painting and like and the landscape and basically working through ideas of the landscape in some ways. But back similar to this like the dogs playing the pool, like maybe there's a sense of humor along the way too. This is like a
Chris, can I just ask you a question? I'm not familiar with creative teaching at all. What would your teachers do? How did they add value in that journey?
In grad school, it was amazingly open-ended. So basically all their, and this was, especially my first year, there were sign-up sheets. And so if you didn't, visiting artists were coming through, it was in New York City, so there was like an amazing host of artists and critics kind of circulating through the school. Sign-up sheets went up a certain day of the week, and you would try to get your name on that for a studio visit, and they would come and visit you and talk to you about your work in the studio for about 20 to 30 minutes. And that was the entirety of it. There's no assignments, nothing like that. It's just you're a professional making it work. There's definitely a maturity issue for me because I was straight out of undergrad. And my undergrad was actually very similar, where there was it was mostly just critique. You were making your work and they would talk to you about it. That doesn't work in every environment, but in some of the, in the places where I went to school, it was, you know, it was a given that you were motivated, that you were, you know, that you were self-directed, and so all the faculty, all the professors, all the visiting artists really wanted to do was just help you, you know, find yourself and kind of give you a sense of direction, or, you know, you hear horror stories in grad schools all the time, or sort of tear you down. I mean, I've had a number of studio visits where they would come in and they would be like, "This is garbage. Like, what are you doing?" You know what I mean? And in retrospect, it's like, what's wrong with that person? You know, like what did they get out of doing that? But you know, they're sort of protecting their turf maybe too in a strange way, because it was a kind of like professional breeding ground. Yeah, so you know, so it's interesting, but there was. It's mostly just critique. It's mostly just kind of feedback on the work that you're making. And one thing that grad school taught me was that it gave me a thick skin. You know what I mean? It made it so that I could hear criticism, and I developed the ability to kind of take what I needed from it and say, and kind of shut out the rest, which is a really great skill to have. And it also, excuse me, I'm doing like an awkward politician.
The other thing about criticism is, to your point, you never truly flush it down the toilet, right?
No.
Because at some point, whether you think it's bad criticism or insightful criticism, you can use it.
Totally. And the wild thing about, for you students who are here too, the wild thing about your you know, what happens in these years is that it never leaves you. And these voices, the critical voices that maybe I wasn't ready to hear it yet, but maybe they weren't so wrong, and they're coming back to me in the studio all the time. I'm still sorting out a lot of the information and a lot of the feedback that I received during that like 6-year period for sure.
So you expressed a few critical comments about the previous slides, and I was just wondering, are those your critiques or are those left over from somebody else?
No, they're mine.
They're yours?
Yeah.
Did they agree with you? Were their critiques online with your critiques, or were they different?
It was a range, you know? I mean, I think that like one thing that was really valuable about it, and about sort of being in a place like New York, is that like it was not a monoculture at all. You know what I mean? There was so many different voices. In one day, there was a studio visit from this guy Jerry Saltz, who's a notable art critic, and then Coco Fusco, who is has a completely different perspective as a writer and a thinker and an artist, and then a California-based conceptual artist, all in the same day. And so you know your head kind of spins, but you also learn the skill. Like I wasn't in the painting ghetto. You know what I mean? I was able to verbalize and talk about my work across like a huge, like I could talk about my work to anybody, whether you're a photographer, sculptor, critic, writer. I was able to talk to you about it, and I think that's hugely valuable. But it was always a mix. It was always I never got a huge pat on the back, and I never got so slammed that I stopped working. From the gardening and the watercolors, I started making. I wanted to get back into painting. A kind of theme throughout all of this stuff is just about how kind of painting. There's something about the act of it that I really connect to. When I was an undergrad, I did sculpture and video and all sorts of different things, but it's about painting. And so I started making these paintings of park, not just the landscape, not the prehistoric landscape, but parks and gardens. And so this is the Chateau at Versailles. Here's another Versailles painting. And in some ways, these are kind of ironic. These are meant to be like, I'm this kid basically, and I'm going to make sort of paintings of like Western civilization's greatest hits or something like that. But it was done with a color palette that was really, that was really moody, right? And almost in a way I was thinking about them as ruins, And then the beginning of my second year of grad school was September 11th, 2001. And so it was, right at the beginning of the semester, and it kind of shut things down for a little bit. I lived up in Washington Heights in northern Manhattan at the time. My bedroom window was right on the West Side Highway, and so I woke up to, it's all the way up on I was on 161st Street in Riverside. So, all the action was way downtown. But I woke up to like emergency vehicles on the West Side Highway and that kind of thing. The field, walked down to Columbia, which is on 116th Street. And just the feeling is like, what do we do? How do we get through it? What happens? And so nobody wanted to take the subway. Class, professors weren't coming up to class. And so I just started walking around. And I found myself walking into Central Park and, just wandering and sort of, I guess, being sort of present. And it was so clean. So you smelled this kind of smell of rubber burning in the city at large. But the park was pristine. There was no people around. It was like there for me. And it almost felt like this kind of hologram. It had this kind of unreal, I'm walking through a dream kind of quality to it. And if it triggered anything, I would already been sort of thinking about parks, and if it triggered anything, it was the sense of like all of this kind of stuff about like, the kind of guilt trip that I was on in terms of like King Leopold at the Congo, about like sort of positioning myself, painting these kind of like Versailles and stuff like that. It was a very kind of self-critical kind of voice where I was almost trying to beat the critics to the punch in some ways, and I just thought I should make something that's personal. And so that September 11th for me wound up being this kind of turning point where my paintings now, like I started to look at my paintings as a place where I, for my own personal connection, right? I wasn't trying to necessarily make as much of a kind of critical point, as I was about trying to express a kind of mindset or kind of connect to the viewer through the painting in a more sincere kind of way. Some of these paintings are very moody, some of them are very melancholy, some of these are very kind of ecstatic and kind of heated up and almost kind of hallucinatory or psychedelic. Here's another large painting where you can see there's this kind of pour. This is like a house paint that I would pour directly onto the canvas, and then it was reflected in the Central Park pond as a kind of impressionist painting style. There's this line in a Woody Allen movie, I forget which one now, where they're shooting a scene in Central Park, and he's like, the actor's out of focus. But the actor's like literally out of focus with the camera, and I like loved that, and I wanted my figures in this painting to also be kind of like out of focus and kind of fading. Very different time in the art world. So I'm 22, and I had my first show in Chelsea. So stepping right out of undergrad into like this kind of thing. And so my show was called Park Paintings. It was at a gallery called Jeff Bailey Gallery. I had just done the summer between grad school and the show in the fall. I was spent in Giverny, where Monet made his paintings, doing a residency with the Terra Foundation of American Art. And so for this show, I'm going to try to move a little quickly because we're still back in 2003. But for this show, it was paintings that were sort of inspired by Central Park and the kind of picturesque, kind of democratic kind of quality of the Olmsted and Calvert Bog designed park. And I contrasted that with images from photos that I took of a park that was being built outside a science museum in Valencia, Spain. And there was something interesting to me about kind of contrasting these two different ideas of what the landscape could be. One is this kind of scenic, picturesque, almost kind of hallmark kind of, but legitimately beautiful kind of park in New York City, and the most valuable real estate on the planet, right? And then this other thing is this kind of maybe a different idea of a more contemporary landscape. Between the time, so after that show, I was still making work. I had other opportunities to show, but it was really a kind of time of exploring. So there's more landscape paintings. I'm getting better as a painter. this is a painting of Prospect Park. This is a painting of Morningside Park, which is near Columbia. You know, I'll keep moving kind of quickly here. So more park paintings, but I'm thinking about the landscape in these different ways. I'm thinking about them as a kind of like embodiment of certain type of ideas, of an embodiment of certain mental states. At the same time, I'm like, I'm stuck in the park. Like, what do I do next? Like, how, like, there was almost a thing where like, where I was starting to attract attention from like galleries and collectors and things, and they really wanted a certain type of painting from me. And sometimes that's great, and that's the kind of encouragement that you need, and sometimes you have to push back against that a little bit and say like, and I was concerned that they were looking at the paintings and sort of prizing them as kind of impressionist paintings, and my thinking about them was not that, right? My thinking about them was kind of about a kind of like positioning them in the culture in a different kind of way. And so I like, what else can I do? And so I actually started making yoga, paintings of yoga practitioners. And I pulled a bunch of these out because I knew I was going to be here. I thought maybe these would connect. And so in some ways, the yoga figure was almost like a kind of figurative equivalent of the way I was thinking about the park, right? It's this kind of was this kind of discipline. It was about a kind of like mind-body merging or kind of meltdown, but also then it was just visually exciting. Like I can paint an aura. Right? There's, you saw the bridge paintings before. This is my first yoga painting, and it's kind of no mistake that the figure is kind of in that pose. That oil-based enamel kind of house paint is kind of curdled up and really chunky, has this really physical aura. But then, the figure itself is kind of dematerializing in some ways, or kind of fading. And so I made a lot of these, and I still, every show, and you'll see them if I get there. It's like every show or two, there's a this kind of type of imagery reoccurs. I like this idea of the yoga classroom as this kind of like communal, ecstatic kind of experience, like this sort of this thing where you kind of in my kind of romanticized mind, kind of like lose some of that kind of sense of individuality and some of that kind of isolation. Here's another classroom. There's almost a kind of a kaleidoscopic kind of thing that's happening here. At the same time I was making these yoga paintings, I'm always, and you're probably starting to get the ideas, I'm always kind of contradicting myself, or I'm always kind of working with this idea of like art creates meaning through contrast, right? And so, or through tension. And so at the same time I'm making these yoga figures, which is about a kind of like communal kind of experience, I'm also making these paintings of radio booths. And this is a painting called The Overnight. And it's about this kind of, it's another analogy for art, or another analogy for the artist, this kind of lone overnight DJ kind of, sitting in this dark box communicating to who knows who. From there, another moment where kind of life and luck and the hand of fate steps in. I hit this moment where I was trying to live off of my art, so that 3 or 4 year period I was just a painter, which was amazing. But the money was running out, the credit cards were now maxed, that kind of thing. And I had a difficult conversation with the woman who's my first wife at the time about I have to give up the studio for a little while because I just can't afford it anymore. And I'm all the time here, I'm teaching as an adjunct, and I'm working day job, freelancing as an art handler, and doing all these different jobs. And I was gonna have to give up the studio, and like literally after that weekend, I get a phone call from a woman who had been, literally that weekend I get a phone call from a woman who had been an art advisor, and an art advisor is somebody who's a kind of middle man between collectors and the artist studios. Then she said, Chris, we saw this show, which is this show here, and we think that we're going to open up a gallery and we'd like you to be part of the gallery. And to get you started, we're going to advance you a large sum of money to make your first show at my gallery. And so it was amazing. And so it was like, it just sort of came to the rescue, and I was able to kind of continue what I was doing. And so this is the show that she saw, which was just the girlfriend of a friend's apartment in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. She had painted everything completely white in the apartment. It was like a 3-room kind of railroad-style apartment. And I said, well, I'm going to do something really special for this show. And so I made 3 paintings, and each one of those paintings fit directly on, like took up 100% of the wall. So I made the paintings in my studio, rolled them up, unrolled them in the apartment, and then literally stretched them on stretcher bars, standing on the painting itself, and then jumped out and pushed it up against, hung it up on the wall. And in these paintings, in these 3 paintings, you again sort of see the yoga practitioners. You can see, if I go back, you can see there's like a pterodactyl in there. There's some of the architecture is actually architecture from mall architecture. And in some ways, I'm like super like food courts and stuff.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, I'm kind of taking a lot of my like past references and imagery that I'm interested in, and I'm kind of colliding it all together. I'm superimposing these different images, and I'm, the act of the painting is kind of how do I negotiate these different images, and how do I, how do I either synthesize them, or how do I kind of leave them kind of broken apart. This is the 3rd painting. This is actually from an image of Jennifer Garner and her kid at the time. And it was actually, I laid a big piece of plastic out on the floor, and I painted on the plastic in this very goopy way, and then smushed it against the canvas, right, and peeled it off, and that's why you get all of this kind of ghostly looking sense from the figure. So from there, so based on that show, I had the conversation with the woman who became my gallerist, this woman, Sue Scott. And as luck would have it, I was able to land a residency at a college called Dickinson College out in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And so I left New York for a couple of months to go out there for the residency and paint the show. And I had never been out of really New York to live since I had moved there. And there was something just about going to a college town, I'd never been to central Pennsylvania, going to central Pennsylvania, that kind of thing. And it was definitely a time of kind of like reflection and kind of searching again. And I had this strange experience where I was walking down the street next to the college, and I saw somebody across the street who I thought I recognized. My friend Mark had passed away from a heroin overdose about a month or so before, and I thought it was him. And so I, went up to the guy, and it wasn't him, but there was something so, for lack of a better word, kind of like moving or intense about that experience, that it really kind of consolidated the language and kind of triggered a kind of mood and a thought process for this show, which was called Fake Your Death. And so I was thinking about this idea of like kind of escape. I was, and I think I had been feeling that way in my life in New York also, right? So it's like it wasn't just this thing about my friend, it was also kind of certain feelings that I was experiencing at the time. But sort of thinking about this idea of escape, this idea of kind of isolation. There's thinking about addiction, obviously. And so I was looking around at the town, this type of like, I don't know, I'm not an architect, but it's this kind of like Victorian architecture, like these kind of townhouses that you see in central Pennsylvania. To me, they were very novel. To me, I'd never seen, and they were starting to wear down. And there was something about that to me I really connected with, and it captured the mood. This feeling of being, here's the landscape again, but there's this feeling of being kind of outside it here, right? Like you're a kind of voyeur, you're kind of like you're not in the landscape, you're disconnected. this feeling of searching. I invented these kind of police characters that were populating some of the paintings. Here they are with little angel wings kind of poking in through the windows of houses. You can see there's my electric candles. Maybe that might even be the first one, actually. This is a painting called Gates, and you can see the whole construction of the painting is about kind of keeping you, the viewer, kind of out of the landscape too, right? So not only, we're kind of kept on the surface. At the same time, thinking about that, I love these books. I love William Blake, and I love this Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. And I was really inspired by the frontispiece to the Songs of Experience, where there's a male character with this kind of cherub on his shoulders. And I had my own memories of being kind of put on the shoulders of my aunt when I was younger, and so I started making sort of, obviously part one of what I just showed you was pretty heavy, and so part two is kind of about this sense of innocence and kind of sense of like a kind of competing impulse in some ways. Here's another yoga classroom. This one's seen as a little bit, maybe through a little bit of a darker, kind of more sunset atmosphere. And so the show is built out of those two, basically those two poles. Here's an install shot from the exhibition.
Is that New York?
Yeah, that gallery is no longer in existence, but it was on Rivington Street on the Lower East Side in Manhattan. So from there, I had made all those paintings when I was doing the residency at Dickinson, and then brought them to New York for the show, and then I owed them a show for my residency that I didn't paint while I was there. That was like part of the deal with the residencies, that I was working on a show. And so I went back to Carlisle, and I gave myself 2 weeks to paint a show. And so what follows is this show called The Rat Retires from the World. And it's based on a La Fontaine fable about the rat, weary from the world of strife, takes refuge in a giant wheel of cheese. And when his fellow rats come and ask him for help against the cats, he's like, "What could I do? I'm just a poor rat in a cheese wheel." And I kind of felt like, as a painter, I was kind of stuck in my own little cheese wheel here. I started thinking about hermits, I was kind of this hermetic idea of like being in the studio. And I got really interested in hermits, and I made paintings that were about hermits and hermit dwellings. And thinking about not only historical hermits, like there's a Pennsylvania hermit. You guys know the Pennsylvania hermit? This guy Amos. They always go off to the woods and live in isolation, but they're always such mad jerks about the world. And so so they'll write manifestos. They'll go off and then they'll write these kind of judging manifestos about the way people should actually be living. And so I kind of as a painter a little bit. J.D. Salinger's like a contemporary hermit. There's examples. But I made these paintings of hermit dwellings, and then also paintings of children as a bit of a contrast to that, right? And so children as this kind of counterpoint, something that's kind of the hermit as having too many worldly experiences that they're overwhelmed and need to retreat. The child as somebody who's kind of open to accumulating that knowledge and accumulating those experiences. Here's a child in the cloister garden. But I had to work fast, so I was making paintings about anything that would vaguely relate. This is St. Christopher with the crossing the river with a baby Jesus on his back. It's a painting titled Heavy Baby Story. My version of a kind of hermit painting, social networking for dummies. And a year or two after, I was invited to go to the University of Central Florida and make a series of etchings based on that body of work. And that was a really wonderful experience that influenced the paintings too. I'm going to move quickly here because I would like, if I was to spend more time, I'd like to get to the more recent work. Into the Mountains was a show in Miami in 2010. Thinking about thinking about contemplation, actually, thinking about kind of peace. But at this, and while I'm doing that, thinking about this kind of, this idea of the mountain, as a site for that, and also as a kind of cultural place, cultural site. And this is the time when I really started to kind of stretch out stylistically in terms of what I'm doing. And so you'll see as I kind of quickly move through a lot of these images that it's really intentionally diverse. So rather than thinking about myself as a painter who worked representing things, right? A representational painter, a painter that you're going to understand that this is a painting of somebody in something in some specific place. And as somebody who does that but brings in ideas of abstraction, here I thought, well, there's all this really interesting middle ground between those two worlds, right? And so rather than kind of limiting myself to one particular style, this show was kind of the first show that I had where I really started to think really specifically about how the painting is not an autonomous thing. It's not just a world unto itself. It's hanging in a room with other works of art that you created, and they're talking to each other. And so for the first time, I really started thinking about like what happens when different styles kind of get put next to each other, different ideas get put next to each other, and those gaps between the paintings, those spaces between the paintings, that became actually very important, very poignant. Like that's sort of where the content came in less. The meaning of the paintings for me were less. This is a kind of abstracted nocturnal landscape to me, but it's less about that than it is what happens when that is next to this, right? And like what kind of emotion arises there? What kind of reflection do you have as a viewer? And I was thinking a lot about music actually at the time, and I was thinking about music's ability to kind of do this sort of thing, right? Like the surprising juxtapositions in music and how music is not tied to a kind of specific representation of something, right? It's something that can go kind of directly to that kind of emotional or psychological, nerve. And that idea became really important to me actually, this idea that a painting can, how it functions with its neighbors and how they interact with each other became a really kind of crucial idea. And my next show in New York reflected that. It was a show called Remake. And the title was kind of a response to all of these movies that were being remade at the time, right? So we're like Spider-Man 1000 and like, this kind of thing. And I was thinking about the kind of history behind imagery. And so this is, I think it's just called Snow Day, or Lovers in the Snow or something like that. But it's actually an image from a movie called Vanilla Sky, which is a remake of Abre los Ojos, a Spanish movie. But the director of Vanilla Sky is this guy Cameron Crowe, who was a music lover, who borrowed this scene from the cover of Bob Dylan's Freewheeling Bob Dylan, right?
Yeah.
And so there's this kind of real interesting kind of history to a single kind of image, right? And I got really interested in like how painting can kind of recontextualize these things, and how and what's what's the role of the artist? Like, where's my subjectivity allowed in this mix, right? If there's all of these kind of remakes and all of these different pre-packaged kind of things, like where can I find wiggle room again? And so here's it was sourced from The Birds by like Hitchcock's Birds. This was sourced from an American Impressionist painting that I kind of remade into a more contemporary image. But I'm also, in the subsequent time between the previous show in New York and this show, my first marriage kind of dissolved, and I found the woman who would become my current wife, and there's this kind of remaking of myself in a way too. So like this idea of like a remake also had a lot to do with the kind of introspective look at like the hermits again, or the yoga figure again, right? Or this kind of figure in a landscape again, and trying to kind of transform that and like reclaim that again for a different idea of who I could be. And so it wasn't, it might have started, the genesis of the body of work might have started from a place of like, what's the deal with all these remakes? Like the culture doesn't want anything like new anymore. And it actually wound up being very much about sort of myself and like thinking about how painting gave me the opportunity to kind of look at myself and change how I thought about myself, right? And sort of in a really kind of real and profound way. And so there's a kind of, I guess you're probably getting the idea now that with all of these shows, there's images that are just uplifting images, and then there's their counterpoint, and so we're kind of in both places. This is a large painting called Mansion. It's actually a painting of the actor Nicolas Cage's repossessed Las Vegas mansion.
Yes. Oh, okay.
And there's like the topless lighthouse, that kind of thing, right? And so there's kind of architecture as a sign of the boarded up house, like this kind of closed down. From there, that last show was so much about imagery again, and about sort of what I wanted to kind of the images to connect to and kind of talk about, that I needed to start just being visual again as an artist. I needed to be. I wanted the sensational side of painting. I wanted the phenomenon. I wanted I wanted the kind of I wanted that kind of feast for the eyes that painting can do. And so I started making these paintings that were built on top of all the paintings that I've shown so far were oil paintings. And these are, now I'm integrating acrylic paint as a kind of first layer, and I'm really saturating that color and making that color really loud and bold. And then I'm working on top of it with oil paint. And the painting itself is sort of about this conversation of color, really. And not responding to specific imagery very much at all. And kind of, in some ways, these paintings are much more kind of a kind of traditional idea of abstraction. They're about a kind of improvisation, right? They're about. I guess we were talking about mindfulness almost in this context earlier, where it's about. They're about the process in a way where they would start somewhere with that kind of acrylic wash. This is actually part ink and part acrylic ground that I built oil paint on top of. Sort of start with something spontaneous and then begin to kind of walk with it and make moves on it and allow it to kind of develop. And where it ended was a question mark. I didn't know where they were going to end. And that was a very different approach for me, because I had, for the previous body of work, I kind of knew what I wanted them to be. And so really, and actually it's very much how I work to this day, is with a much more kind of open-ended approach to what the imagery will wind up being and to where the painting will take me. So this is a painting called Two Ships, and it's a superimposed, I would make drawings of these things, and then I would project them with an overhead projector onto the canvas, and then use the paint to kind of work between the different images that I would overlay via the projector. And we were in New York at the time, but I got a phone call that we were pregnant. And so this is my response. This is my kind of Scooby-Doo anxiety painting. And this painting is wrapped up right now, but it's in my office, and I'm going to put it back up because I love it for what it was. It was just kind of like, what's going to happen? I was not like, oh no, we shouldn't have a baby. I was just like, what's my life going to be? As any new parent would be. And it actually led to, that painting is kind of spastic, and my life became very, like my thinking became very spazzy. And I had been in New York, and I said, I need to grow up. I need to, I love teaching, and so I started a teaching search that, was all over the country. I applied to jobs from Maine to Albuquerque, and landed in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for 2 years. And it was great. At an art school in Milwaukee, and I loved it. But it's a transition. And so the work that I was making in Milwaukee, which was part of the show in Minneapolis, was a 2-person show with a good friend of mine who makes sculpture. The work was kind of about maybe some of that anxiety, and I began to kind of superimpose these images in a way that made them really opaque, right? They were really dense, and they're really kind of hard to read, This painting is called Fiction and Nonfiction. It's the first image that's kind of obscured is of John Grisham, the writer, and then there was a girl that just some image that I found of a girl on a dating website that was kind of overlaid. So it's this kind of male-female double portrait. This is a painting called Pine Tree Yoga Cloud. There's a drawing of a pine tree, a drawing of clouds that's some of the heavier kind of black lines. And then there is a yoga figure doing a headstand kind of in here. This is her elbow, right? So elbow, her head, where her elbow is kind of swinging down that way. And this is another electric candle painting, precursor to the one that we started with. Still shots from the show. The transition from I wanted to move back to the East Coast. That's where I'm from. That my wife is actually from the Bronx and also Westchester County, and so we knew that we wanted to come back. And so that actually led me to Westchester University here. In the fall of 2014 is when I was hired, and that kind of transition era is the work. I've been tying the work here really closely with my biography, the whole talk, but I think this idea was a transition period in my life. It was a transition period in the work too, and I think that I love, during the time all these paintings are being made, I'm always drawing, and I really value this idea of drawing as being really like in some ways like the most intimate kind of connection you can have with an artist, or the artist can have with the artwork, right? There's just such a kind of that's where the artist's voice is. That's where that real kind of connection kind of happens. And so I was making a lot of drawings during the time, which in retrospect are kind of my favorite thing. That more than the paintings, I actually really love these drawings and the kind of range of different imagery that I was working from. This is a still from a kind of imagined Hamlet. This is Amanda Knox. I'm all over the place in terms of my thinking, but the drawing is the kind of consistent aspect. And really, so I'm trying to kind of be faster here. Again, I think we should sort of think about this period as being one of kind of exploring what I wanted to do with the artwork, but also exploring who am I now? I'm no longer a young guy. I'm no longer in New York or in the Midwest. I have one young kid, and my first year back at Westchester, we had another one. So I'm a new dad. And this is kind of the period. This is actually TV dad. This is from a pharmaceutical commercial of a kind of TV dad kind of doing dad stuff. I'm questioning all of it, and I'm like, there's these worlds that I'm inhabiting as a teacher and as a professional artist and as a family person. And what do these worlds have to do with each other? It felt to me like they were so at odds with each other. Right? I can't be a great teacher because I'm too busy with my family, with my art. I can't be a great artist because I'm too busy with that kind of thing. And I'm looking for a way to kind of integrate that and to tell that story in the paintings, you know? And I guess maybe not surprisingly, it led me back to the landscape in a lot of ways. And it led me back to kind of thinking about the landscape and looking at it again with kind of fresh eyes. Yeah. And this is a painting which is actually I found on a lot of these paintings are sourced. I haven't even talked about where they're sourced from. They're sourced from not only internet searches, but historical artworks and that sort of thing. But this is actually from like a real estate website where I found the house that I grew up in Neighborhood, New York, up until I was in 4th grade. And it was a very eerie experience. Because like that house, I could buy that house for like $60,000. Wow. It was this little like we called it the townhouse, but it was like a row home, you know. But the door was open in the photo, and that freaked me out for some reason. I couldn't believe that the door was open in the photo, and I don't know, it was something about it. But yeah, so I kind of refound the landscape, and I started to think about the landscape differently, in the sense that I wanted it to reflect these new experiences that I was having, and I wanted it to reflect that desire to kind of bring all these disparate worlds together. But not even just those worlds. I mean, like now I'm having these new experiences where I'm like driving around town for the first time, and I have I'm looking for a new radio station. I have the GPS going. I'm noticing the new stores that are over here. I'm thinking about my new job. I'm thinking about my family. It's this kind of real competing foci everywhere, right? Like and I think that's kind of the world that we all live in now, isn't it? And that's a world that we inhabit, but we want to sort of work with and sort of find our place in, right? This kind of, and so, a painting like this, to me, I felt like I was starting to connect to this idea, like through the layering of the paint, through these different kind of painting ideas, texture ideas, color ideas. I felt like I was starting to I was able to talk about the landscape as being, again, a kind of like reciprocal or vehicle for these different kind of types of information and these different types of thoughts and different types of media. And so that takes us up to Tree Streets, which is, I live in Wallingford, Pennsylvania, and I live in the Tree Streets. It's a kind of like it's like the little suburban neighborhood in the town where the houses are closer together and more affordable, and I live on Pine Road, but there's cedar and maple, and that's where the Tree Street comes from. And so the title of the show is The Tree Streets, and they were basically built, and it took me a long time to figure out these paintings. I actually started them the week that Trump was elected. I had all of these canvases kind of laid out and ready to go, and I had one idea, and then that happened, and I was kind of like, what do this is not even necessarily a political statement. I personally felt like kicked in the head, and I felt like I couldn't, I felt like there had to be a response, but I didn't know what that response was going to be. And so I started these paintings without knowing what the response was going to be. And that was my answer. I was just like, I'm going to start going. And again, this is maybe what we're kind of talking about, is that I didn't have a prescribed idea for what the end goal was going to be, and I didn't know what the steps were going to be to get there, but I sort of trusted the idea that if I'm sincere, that if I am energetic and motivated, that I'm going to get somewhere. And so this is, these paintings kind of as a whole kind of talk about that, to me they almost talk about these drives, like this driving thing again between my studio in South Philly, my home in the suburbs, through industrial areas, through commercial areas, through past mansions, that kind of thing, and then my drive out here to Westchester, right? And there are these kind of combined experience, they're the sort of the kind of internal experience of that and the external experience of that kind of laid on top of each other. And of course, they're like filled with the histories. I don't know what I'm painting. And so they're really built up, and they're really, they're really, each of them is dense with the story of their own creation, right? This is a painting called Blue Love, and actually this was, I have something here into it. So we all have cell phones, and maybe it won't work.
My desktop.
It's just weird when it gets kind of rich. This is the very professional portion of my artist talk. All right, so the painting started out as this. I'm just gonna just really quickly, as I kind of my interest, right? Sort of like I said that they go through stages, but you'll see it. So it started off as basically a drawing of a green man, which is in the it's a kind of gargoyle-like nature spirit that was that's like a carving that they use in architecture and in European architecture, and to me this seemed like kind of how I was. Again, sort of like that's how I was feeling at the time. It seemed to kind of resonate. And then I'll just kind of quickly walk you through how these things kind of come together. So it became a vertical. That's my hand, in case you were wondering.
Oh, but it's not done with that painting then?
So I'm like, it needs, painters do this. They're like, it needs something there. What happens if I block that area out? And then I was like, yeah, you use that color. It's actually pretty good there too. It looks kind of blue. And I was like, I should just paint my hand. And so there's my hand. And then it winds up getting now it's going. Oh, I got it. Sorry. The big reveal is taking longer than yeah, there you go. So so I wound up being there. And I do this all the time. I take lots of photos as I go, and it's I'd say probably 90% of the time it's heartbreaking. You're like, oh, I should have stopped there. But every once in a while, it's interesting. It's actually an interesting thing to kind of reflect on, right? And sort of see how you almost don't know how your brain works until you kind of see it. But yeah, so these paintings, this is a painting called Night Walk, and they're really dense. If there is figure, if there is landscape, it's kind of obscured and hidden. And to me, I started off by talking about how I like this idea of paintings being slow, right? Paintings being something that you live with, that change over time, that you can kind of like reflect on and spend time with. And so a painting like this might at first just seem like a jumble, but I spend months with each of these, right? And so if you were to, in turn, sort of spend time with them, they would hopefully kind of change every day for you and kind of evolve and that sort of thing. So more, sort of abstracted landscape. This painting is called, some are called the ecstatic view of the suburbs. This one is called, I think, hypnagogic landscape, which is that kind of space between waking and sleeping, right? That kind of moment where you're just kind of emerging from sleep. So I see them as being kind of dreamlike in that way. This is where we started, and some install shots of this show. This was up in Harlem, actually. Quickly, I sort of want to finish with these two somewhat more recent bodies of work. First group of work is called student work. It's my work, but I call it student work because I was engaging with students. So this is a show at Westchester. This is a show at the Knauer Gallery in the Swope Music Building that I had in the fall of this year. And I wanted to do something different again. And I felt like that last body of work was really, I love it. I still like that body of work, and it's holding up for me, and it's interesting. But it's like all about me, and it's all about in my head and my headspace and my own experiences. And I needed to reach out again. So I asked students if they would pose for portraits for me. I'd never painted, even as an undergrad, I'd never really painted portraits before. I painted dogs and stuff, dinosaurs. And so this group of paintings was a mix of other recent work and these portraits that I did of current and former students. And it was really an amazing experience because it was a shared experience with somebody. So the paintings were not about me. They weren't about like my ego. They weren't about my about what's different about my headspace that other people would find interesting. It was about this time that I got to spend with these students, and the kind of me being very honored that they would spend the time with me, and just kind of connecting with them. And most of these sort of happened in an afternoon. They all happened in 3 or 4 hours per painting, really quick. The plan was that I was going to take them back to my studio and edit them, and work them, and it was. The shared experience was what it was all about. There was no need to edit them. It was a performance. It was just a way to connect with them and I felt very, the whole thing was very rewarding and I felt very honored to have the ability to do it. And then I kind of snuck in this kind of globe with a hat painting into the show also. And this was a painting that was also in the show that was built out of a drawing that my 6-year-old did. So he was drawing from life these kind of hanging plant things that we have. And then so I stole that drawing from him and I projected it onto my painting. And so this is almost like a collaboration with my 6-year-old son. And then lastly, when I was in Carlisle at Dickinson College, I became really good friends with the other painting faculty member there, and we've played music together, and and when I got my studio in Philly, he was feeling a little isolated out in Dickinson, and so he started sharing my studio space with me. And then since he was coming in anyway, we started to collaborate on some paintings, and we would just leave them around. So we don't talk about them, we just have paintings that are hanging out in the corner that I'll start a little bit on, and then he'll do a little bit with. And I'm going to show you some of those. And I have to say, like this is a very large painting, actually. In the same way that painting portraits of my students got me out of my own head and allowed me to connect with them, and it wasn't so much about this kind of narrative and storytelling that I'm creating and my own deal. Being in these collaborative situations works very similar. I don't know in a lot of these what he did and what I did, and it doesn't matter. I don't have to paint. Except obviously I did the dinosaur. I don't have to paint a certain way, right? So I can experiment with voice. I can assume a different character completely. When I make these paintings, they're legitimately fun to make, enjoyable and surprising. We're kind of discovering things that I'm enthusiastic about, and discovering strange painting ideas that I had not before. And so, I think maybe that connects to sort of the mission here as well, right? There's this kind of the way that these paintings take me out of my own head. They make me sort of respond to what's there. They don't necessarily have an end goal. They're about the kind of exploration and discovery, kind of connected to the process. And that is Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Do you want to have any questions or anything around anything that we kind of were able to connect to today?
Very impressive. I'm really glad we came this morning. But I'm just curious going through this a little bit. Love to hear a little bit more about the process, particularly the early paintings like the yoga studio. I recognize that. I mean, do you do the body from your head? Do you take some photographs? You mentioned projecting stuff up.
Yeah.
Again, do you a little bit more? Do you make sketches beforehand?
Yeah.
How long do these take? Do you work on multiple paintings? All that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, over the years, the process changes all the time, right? I mean, I think that part of it is just to keep yourself kind of interested. You always vary up the formula, you know? But I think I've always been an artist who's more interested in, I'm not as interested. I think there's certain artists who are about kind of refining a process, right? And who kind of work towards a kind of like, they have an idea of like perfection in their mind, and then they work towards that and they hone their craft over the years. And there's other artists, and I put myself in this camp, who are more interested in kind of constantly changing and constantly doing things kind of differently, and so like where it finishes is kind of like a surprise. Like I want to be surprised, and I think like the music that I listen to, the musicians are you know, I think in other art forms I appreciate that sense of like kind of risk taking or something that I try to cultivate. But a lot of the you know, the only work that I've done from observation are those portraits. So everything else is either made up from my imagination or is from a photographic source or an illustrative source of some kind. But I don't ever work with the photo in my hand. And so it's important to kind of mediate that. So I'll have a photo and maybe I'll make a drawing from the photo and then a drawing from the drawing, and then I'll use that as the source. There's a look, I'm on the admissions, the portfolio review for Westchester here, and in our requirements, there has to be work from observation, you know, not which, and we specifically say not from photographic sources or copied, and you can tell every time, there's just a look to something. There's a way that photographs kind of objectify and organize space that I don't want in my painting. So it's really important for me, even when I'm using a photographic image, to develop it through drawing, I think, first.
Do you work on multiple paintings at once? How long does one of these take? How long you work?
Well, that always changes too. But in later years, they're taking longer. And I think that's actually, I like that I'm able to spend time with them and let them kind of marinate. And I'm always working on multiple. So I never just work on one painting at a time. You know, Catherine was in my studio yesterday with a school group, and I have 25 paintings, 30 paintings kind of happening all at once. And so it's not, I don't find it to be productive to put too much pressure on one thing at a time. And actually, the way that painting kind of, I work fast. When I'm painting, I work really fast. Like, you know, I'll work in like 1 hour spurts on a painting. But there's many hours of kind of looking at it. Sometimes like very carefully and very attentive looking at it, and sometimes it's just sort of like living over there for a while out of the corner of your eye, and you learn a lot about it through that also. And also, you know, there's like, and if you're going to be open up to the process and open to like discovering things, you also have to be open to like, not everything turns out, and that's okay too, you know what I mean? So I think there's like, you know, in ceramics they talk about like a 50% kind of fire rate, right? And it's kind of the same in my studio too, or maybe half of what I'm making, you know, doesn't ever see, you know, the light of day, really. It doesn't leave the studio.
So you said